All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where in Europe you are. Just wanted to tell you a couple stories about golden visas in light of Trump's golden visa declaration yesterday. So let's start sharing my screen. Here we have a headline from The Guardian in Europe. Trump gold card, which of course is going to call it a gold card, to rich foreigners. Starts a route to U.S. citizenship for $5 million. This is meant to replace the current EB-5 immigrant investor visa program, which allows individuals to reside in the U.S. in return for job-creating investments of at least $1 million or $800,000 in distressed parts of the country. So not New York, but in distressed parts of America. Now, there's not much more information on this so far. I understand, as I read it, we'll go through the numbers here, but as I read it, $5 million is the fee. So this is actually a fee to the government. And obviously, someone who has $5 million to just pay a fee, not invest, but just to pay a fee is obviously going to be, as it says, among the global super rich. So that's what it is. Let's talk about it a little bit. As some of you know, I am American Latvian. Been living over in this part of the world for over 15 years now, before the global financial crisis, in fact, in 2008, and really closer to 20 years. And here we have little Latvia, and you can see it's on the Baltic Sea. The Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine. Obviously, we have the Ukraine war raging now for 3 years, into its fourth year, all part of the Soviet Union. Okay, Baltics illegally annexed in 1944, and I've talked about this many times. We'll continue to talk about it. Ukraine is fighting their way out still, which they have been doing for over 10 years now, since the Maidan Revolution, second Maidan Revolution in 2014. If you look at this map, and you understand that the Soviet Union itself, right, the epicenter in Moscow, was closed to the rest of the world in the Cold War times. The communist empire was closed to the outside world. And if you just look at where, people, normal people, even somewhat well-to-do apparatchiks in the communist empire would like to go in the summer, because still people are people. They want to go to the seaside if they can. People love water. Where would they go? Where would they go? Well, obviously you have the Black Sea. That's a huge, obvious locale. And we know all the political turmoil that has happened around the Black Sea in the last 10 years, starting from Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea in 2014. Where else could they go besides the Black Sea in Ukraine, besides Odessa over here, Crimea, Mariupol? Where else could somewhat well-to-do apparatchiks from Moscow or St. Petersburg go in the summer? Well, St. Petersburg itself has a pretty limited coastline. This is actually a swamp, fairly swampy area that they built St. Petersburg on, former Swedish lands. The only other obvious locale inside the Soviet Union is the Baltics. All right, it is the Baltics. We see here we still have a very tenuous border, 100 kilometers here. This is the Suwalki Gap, named after the Polish city that is on the border here between Lithuania and Poland. That's 60 miles, 100-kilometer border, and the Russians still hold Kaliningrad, which is a highly militarized zone that used to belong to Baltic Germans, being the headquarters of Prussia, basically the Prussian world. Königsberg, now Russified to the word Kaliningrad. Anyway, of course they could go to Kaliningrad, all right, or they could go to the Baltics, all right, besides going down to Odessa or Crimea. And obviously you can see here, from a train to St. Petersburg for sure, or even from Moscow, it's quicker. It's quicker than going down to the Black Sea. So wanted to talk about this area right here, Yurmala, zooming in. Yurmala is a famous beach town in Latvia, but it's also famous in the Soviet Ruski Mir, okay, in the Soviet sort of romanticized vision of their world power. Because it's close to St. Petersburg and Moscow, still to this day, of course, before the invasion, when Russians would come, there was a joke, I believe, where you could sit in, 4 hours of Moscow traffic to go to your dacha, or you could just take a flight to Riga and be in Yurmala and your seaside villa faster. So it's very close. It's very convenient for the old rich metropole now, people that would want to come in to Latvia and enjoy the sea during the summer. But of course now, specifically since the 2022 invasion, it's much more complicated. But geographically, naturally, simply from the fact that there's a beautiful coast here, you can tell it's very possible that this could be a very popular locale. It's a major airport right here, capital of Latvia, Riga. In fact, it's on this side of the river, right? So it's right about here. And it's a 10, 15-minute drive to Yurmala compared to hours of Moscow traffic. Of course, I'm just speaking from a neighbor from the East's perspective of finding somewhere warm to holiday in the summer on the sea, on water. Yurmala is a top spot, all right? And not just now or 3 years ago before the invasion, but in the last 100 years, specifically because of, a closed-off communist society that they had, okay? Warm water, less wind, very windy here on the coast here on Liepāja or Ventspils or Klaipėda, which is in Lithuania. This is a very windy coast. So there's a lot of things going for it from that side, all right? So I want to tell you about what happened here in Yurmala over the last 15 years. But to start that story, I'd need to talk about what happened to Latvia in the global financial crisis. All right, so these are the worst hit countries in 2009. This is their GDP growth of the worst hit countries in 2009. But here's their 2007 GDP growth. Okay, so I have the worst hit countries plus Germany plus the United States in this chart. All right, you notice Latvia has the best performance here, but I'm telling you it's about to be the worst. Okay, so it had a 32% GDP growth in 2007. Now let's look at GDP growth in 2009. All right, these are according to the World Bank, this is in native currency terms. All right, the worst hit countries, you got Trinidad, Libya, Brunei, Kuwait, and then Latvia. Latvia had a 22.5% hit, which was massive, okay? And if you think that, all right, you went up 32% in 2009, you only fell 22% in 2000, you went up 32% in 2007, you only fell 22% in 2009. Well, that's not so bad, actually. Just got to look at the simple law of returns here, all right? You start with $100, and if you fall down even 50%, that gets you to $50. To get back to your $100, it's not a 50% return, it's a 100% return. All right, the numbers look more crazy the worse you get. Interesting total side note, why Bitcoin is such a powerful asset, even though it's new and being adopted. And it does have a side role in all of this when we're talking about store of value and where people can, just good, hardworking people can keep their money. Bitcoin has had multiple, 4 times at least, 75, 80% guttings of its value. And that means to get back to its prior value, it has to go 300%, much more, in fact. But anyway, going back to this chart, a 22% GDP hit in 2009, which was even, another 5, 7% in 2010. You're getting, over 30% negative, okay? Negative, getting somewhere around here for Latvia. That means you got to go 54, even 67% to get back where you were. 54, 67% GDP growth doesn't happen often, even if you're China. All right, and Latvia had a huge 32%. This is I'll tell you in a sec why that happened, but it was a huge inflated 32% growth in 2007. The point is, to get back to where you were, you got to go 50, 60% at least, because again, they had a 22.5%, 25% drop in 2009, plus another 5. You're at 30, 35. Let's just say 50%, okay? Latvia had to grow 50% to get back to where it was in 2008. Economies don't grow 50% a year. They might grow 5 if you're lucky, and that was post-crisis. It took a long time. So that's 10 years. 10 years at 5% a year to get back to where you were from a 35% drop, which is about what happened between 2008 and 2011 in Latvia. Even more, in fact. Something like this. Point is devastating. All right. And if you see something like, even a 10% drop, 20% drop, remember, it takes you 25% gain to get back to just where you were. All right. It's much worse in Latvia. So why did this happen? Why did they have such a huge growth, the country of Latvia in 2007, and then such a, one of the world's worst in 2009? By the way, just for reference, Germany, 4% up, 4% down. This is in native euros for Germany. This is in native dollars for the United States. 4% up, only 2% down for the United States. Of course, these are larger economies. And even though they had bubbles, they did not have the bubble that Latvia had. What was the main bubble for Latvia, the Baltic states? It was, like many places, property. Property. So this is what Latvia decided to do in light of the crisis. All right. They decided to offer what's called the Golden Visa, or a residency permit program by investment. Okay, started in 2010 to attract foreign investment. All right, they say that it's brought the country 1.5 billion euros, okay, in revenues. Since then, more than now that's absolutely going to have there's economics in that number as well. It's not just in fees, and I'll show you that mathematically here in a second. Since then, they say not quite 20,000 people have received a residence permit by investment. And what does it cost? You have to buy at least 250,000 euros worth of real estate. This was smaller 15 years ago. It was even in lats at the time, which was different currency and different amounts. It was like 100,000 lats at the time, which was like $200,000, and they raised it more and more to now it's 250,000 euros, all right, for one property. And you have to pay a fee to the state right here, 25,000. Okay, so Trump wants 5 million. In Latvia, you had to pay 25,000 plus 250,000 in property investment. Here's one of the old oligarchs. This is a 2011 article. This is in Latvian, but he basically says this program, this residency program, is going to bring in billions of investments, all right? Now, this article does say 1.5 billion euros in revenues, but let's tear into that a little bit more. All right. And in fact, I'll tear into it more in just a second. Let's go through my tiles here, my different pieces of information. This is a Latvian article. I've Google translated it for you. What was the economic effect of this? Okay, so this is now pre Putin invasion of Crimea, 2010, 2011, 2012, really the dark days of the crisis. Latvia had, there was no money to do bailouts. There was just, or stimulus, I should say. There was just pure hard cost cutting. IMF wanted Latvia to devalue its currency. It did not do that. Neither did Estonia or Lithuania, totally proving wrong the IMF and the likes of Paul Krugman. Whole interesting story about that. The only way that they recovered was to what they called an internal devaluation. They internally cut their costs in the public sector, and it was very hard, but they did it. Nonetheless, they had this idea that allowing foreigners to come in and purchase land would be some sort of a counterbalance to all of the hardships that were going to happen on the cost side, on the expense side. But as we know, economics is wrought with unintended consequences. Here's a broker in Yurmala giving an interview. This is quite an old article. It's 2016, I believe. So Crimea had already even happened, and Russia itself took a big hit from sanctions back in 2014, 15, and 16 because of Putin's invasion in Crimea. But there's a number I want to find here for you about, all right, so this is Yurmala. This is this beautiful seaside area right here. A lot of old villas and a lot of new apartments that were being built. In 2016, look at that. We counted that approximately 600 apartments have been built in Yurmala, but have not been sold. Okay, this is an impressive number, and developers need to think about what to do with these empty apartments. It's a huge number. All right, I can tell you for Yurmala, if you're talking about a development that has 30 or 40 apartment buildings each, which that in itself is a huge development, this is a huge number. All right, I know this is an older figure. Couldn't find something much newer for you, but you just need to go to Yurmala and you walk around. In the winter in particular, it will be completely dead, like a ghost town. There's nobody there. And if you look in the apartment buildings of these newly renovated apartment buildings from developers in the last 15 years, they're completely empty. They may even have owners by now. I'm talking pre-2022 invasion. They may even have owners from Russia or Kazakhstan or Belarus or wherever to bring in that revenue for the state. But they would still stand empty. Okay, and I'm not even bringing into the war into the picture. I'm just saying investors would come in, buy an apartment, and the apartment would just be empty. All right, maybe they would come in the summer for a week or something, but more often than not, they just wouldn't come. All right. Add on top of that the fact that developers completely miscalculate with this program, and people don't buy anyway. That's what happened, and so it basically became a ghost town of these, half new, half old buildings that needed renovation, and it's very problematic. It was very problematic for the town. It wasn't really, looking too amazing. Here's a Quora. I'm just trying to find English good sources. You don't have to listen to me on here. This is why are there so many abandoned wooden houses in Jūrmala, Latvia? Okay, I'm gonna read this. This is probably from a Brit. It says he lived there. This is only a year ago. I live about 20 minutes from there and go there often. There are a number of reasons why there's so many abandoned wooden houses in Yurmala. Okay, so think of like Martha's Vineyard or Cape Cod, some old cottages. There are a lot of beautiful houses in Yurmala at this moment, but it's so overpriced with Russian oligarch money that nobody can renovate. So here we go. Some of the reasons. Some of the houses are owned by people who live in other countries and do not have the interest or money to restore them. Residence permit will exacerbate that. Some are owned by people who live in Latvia but do not have the money to restore them. Fine. Some are abandoned because the owner did not have the money to pay the taxes. Fine. Some do not have clear titles and there's no one who can prove ownership. I'd say that's more rare. It's more of a Soviet issue and it's more rare for those. Some would be too expensive to renovate. Renovation of these is highly restricted by the local government. They must be restored, not just rebuilt. This is a local problem. They're trying to keep the old historic characteristics of these buildings, and in my opinion, very bad policy. These are, we're not talking new buildings here. We're talking old wooden houses. Here's some of the flavor of them. Completely empty, abandoned. That is a local policy problem for sure. And then here we go here. Most are for sale, but the owners want unrealistic prices for them. They planned on selling them to rich Russians at those prices, but now the Russians are not coming and other foreign tourists have no interest in having an expensive property in Latvia. They do not have the nostalgic feelings for Yurmala like Russians. So the houses just sit there deteriorating. Okay, so again, go back to this idea that because Latvia was a closed society for 50 years during the Soviet times, and the people that came to dominate here were the metropole, somewhat well-to-do apparatchiks from the communist centers would come here and buy up property, both, of course, during the 90s when this thing, when property started to be privatized, but even more so exacerbated after the global financial crisis. In the end of the day, you're actually just getting a spot to park capital, kind of like money washing, but it's not I shouldn't mix those things. Money washing is different than just parking capital. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt, even if you are just a normal citizen that is afraid of the Russian government and what they're going to do to their capital. You can be completely a normal business person, well-to-do person from a CIS, former Soviet country, come into Latvia who has this program and just park capital there. But there are unintended consequences, and they certainly hurt the people of the local country. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. So let's look at some other unintended consequences. Again, not just in Latvia. Here's Canada. All right, over the past 10 years as well, they've had probably more than 10 years. I'm not actually sure. Across Canada had these golden visa programs or visa by acquisition programs. All right, here you see the remote town of, not sure how you say that, Bradian in Western Canada was abandoned after local gold mine closed in 1971. The asking price today was just $840,000. So a whole town for $1 million loonies was purchased by a Chinese investor. But what happened in Canada? Same thing. I very much know that our Canadian friends would say that there are ghost towns in, or even ghost properties in Toronto. And so what did Canada do? They made it illegal. They had this foreign buyer program for visas. They made it illegal because A, prices were rising. B, there's nobody that actually lives there. It's just a place to park capital. And then C, the supposed economic investment benefit from all those jobs and all those people coming never materialized. Okay. And look at what happened now. A year ago, or a couple years ago, Canada made this. This is from 2023, this article. Why Canada's ban on foreign buyers hasn't made homes more affordable. So the problem, prices were bid up. Also, no one lived there. They repealed it in 2022, 3 years ago. Okay. It was called the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act in 2022. Okay. This was a knee-jerk reaction to a probably prior knee-jerk golden visa type deal. And again, Canada, Latvia, now the United States, they're not the only countries that do this, but there are unintended consequences. Has that helped? No, it hasn't helped prices in Canada. And in fact, here's another interesting point. Because this is such a political issue, you have things like exemptions, which water down the ban even still. So a few months after the ban was put into place, more exemptions were added. These included students, first-time buyers, and properties under $500,000. There were so many exemptions to the foreign buyer ban that it really didn't make any difference at all. All right. So original law A causes consequence B causes new law B, so on and so forth. This is what has happened. All right. So let's take a look at some raw numbers now. This is not that complicated, and I think this is interesting. Here I got the Latvia residency program. I got the Trump golden visa program. All right, in Latvia, as of now, 250,000 euros. Okay, but let's look at what the government actually could have made, and this is high by calculation. They say 1.5 billion. They're throwing other things in here. 20,000 permits were issued under this program in the last 15 years in Latvia. That's high. It's probably less. I mean, they say 19,000, whatever, in this very recent article. 25,000 euros per permit. That's high as well. All right. Back 10 years ago, it wasn't that high. Regardless, it's 500 billion. Latvia in 2023 spent 17.5 billion in the government. All right. So this whole program over 15 years is 3% of 1 year's budget of Latvia. That's what it amounted to. If you amortize that, split it back over 15 years, you're only at 0.2%. 0.2% of 1 year government budget is this program. This is where you have to start asking yourself, is it worth it? Now, America, no question, whole different kettle of fish than Latvia. But let's at least see where we are to sort of break even or run the numbers in America. Trump says 5 million. I'm assuming this 5 million is a pure fee to the government, pure revenue to the government budget to shrink the deficit. Okay. Maybe you can even say the intentions are good there. All right. So over 15 years, if you get, and here I have my comparison with Latvia, if you're 3x Latvia, which should not be a problem, obviously, that's 60,000 permits. That would, at 5 million a permit, that would bring you 300 billion. Still, government of the United States spends 10 trillion. Now everybody wants to cut that. We're talking about cutting it, fine. But if you look at a apples to apples comparison with Latvia, all right, that would get you the same percentage of the budget. You only have to do 3x Latvia. Yes, we know America can do that. All right, 60,000 permits. All right, that would bring in $300 billion over 15 years, which again, just straight up against 1 year of budget, that's 3%, or 15 years, 0.2%. Okay. Now, obviously, the United States could do much more. Question is, how much more? Latvia is about 150 times smaller than America population-wise. So let's just go ahead and 150x this. If the United States issued 3 million permits to the ultra-rich at 5 million a pop, all right, now those are some big numbers. It's $15 trillion. United States spends United States spends $10 trillion a year. So 150% of a 1 year budget. But again, I'm assuming a 15-year program here to get up to 3 million at 5 million a pop. You don't just blow it all in the first weeks, so to speak. You have to be at least somewhat cognizant of who you are allowing into this program. And indeed, in Latvia, they might not be such strict checks, but you got to check criminal records, you got to check health records, you got to check a lot of things if you're going to open up this pathway to citizenship. Nonetheless, bringing in 3 million of the ultra rich just on this program alone could, if you amortize it over the same 15 years like Latvia, could do 10% of the current spending a year. Not nothing. Certainly not nothing. You got to ask yourself a few different questions on these variables. How likely is that government spending is going to fall below 10 trillion, okay, without a crisis happening, or the Doge team being sidelined? And again, most Americans do want a smaller budget, so I'm not going to comment on that, the political issues surrounding what Doge is or isn't doing. But if you open it up to 150 times the Latvia program at a $5 million a pop proceed, yes, that would give you $15 trillion in revenue. And then, of course, the big question is, that's just for the permit, right? What else are they going to spend in America? And this is where I think, indeed, one needs to think about what you're actually getting. Because in Canada, it became a pure store of value, all right? Whether it was Chinese or Russian, and my understanding was it was actually usually Asian investment in Canada, okay, was empty apartments. You got a lot of empty apartments. You got prices rising. You got the local citizens being squeezed out. And then they had to change the law. And even after changing the law, by the looks of this article at least, Canadians, please let me know in the comments, it seems like it's still you're still having a rough go of it. It's still quite difficult to make this make any sense for helping the local people. So that would be my my challenge to this Trump golden visa program. Of course, America is very different than Canada or than Latvia. People are going to want to move to the United States, going to want to hold property in the United States. But you can do that if you have money right now in New York. For sure, you can do that. All right. And like we saw here with the other original article, if you invest $1 million in distressed parts of the country as well, you can do that. You really got to be careful about the actual representation of these people that you are bringing into the country. And I know that sounds protectionist or nationalist or not free market, but this is the world that we're moving into right now. And it's interesting to me, Europe has tried this over the last 20 years in places that have been underinvested: Portugal, Greece, Latvia, Cyprus. Those are about the only ones that really have made a push to this. And I can say, at least in Latvia, it has done barely anything. All right. If you look at that as a proportion of the budget, it's done nothing. All right. And they can say 1.5 billion in that article. I think they're including some investment gains. If you just run the straight math, it's 500 million. And that's, I'm sure, high. I'm sure it's high. That's 0.2% of the government budget. It would be a travesty to invite in people that are not helpful to America's interest and even get this percentage, I would say, 0.2%. So this is where, and then of course, what are the odds that you're going to have people that are not helpful to America's interest if you bump that up to, 1% of the population, 3 million people? Yeah, you could get 10% a year in the budget covered from these fees, but at some point, you might start to see some blowback. What is the blowback? Beyond Canada, all right, here we have more on Latvia, we have more on, obviously, what happened in Latvia. Beyond just the situation is then we have Putin waging a war on our good neighbors in Ukraine. So then people started to investigate how much, Russian oligarch money was actually in Yurmala, in these places. And that program, by the way, is shut down for Russians now in Latvia. So that's not even, if it is Russians and Belarus, rich Belarusians that want to come here and vacation here, that's not even open anymore for political reasons. Okay. I like this headline: Yurmala, where modern fortune meets faded glory. Old houses that can't be restored. And even with this program, they weren't restored, even before the invasion. Okay, but anyway, I want to bring it back to now. This is the more bombastic point, but I do think it all comes back to this at the end of the day. All right. If you haven't heard of this, the monster plot, it was a theory that the Soviet Union's KGB had infiltrated the CIA at high levels. Okay, this was promoted by James Jesus Angleton, CIA counterintelligence official. He worked at it basically his whole life. Some argued that it paralyzed the CIA. Some argued that it was overblown, even though there were many Russian moles that were found in the CIA during the 70s and the 80s. This was an idea that people said was overblown. But there are plenty of stories that I think one could read or should read that talk about the political views of the current president of the United States. And, whether you see him as out for the interests of the American people or out for the interests of himself, there are plenty of places you can read about his prior visits to the Soviet Union and his prior engagements with people of power in Russia. And I find it very interesting that, we had this UN vote where the United States, Belarus, Russia, supposedly in the interest of good negotiations, let's see how that plays out, vote against Ukraine. Again, these UN resolutions are pointless, but I find that interesting when there's a lot of, signs on the wall that this is just, for example, Trump being Trump, looking out for himself or not looking out for the American people. Craig Unger, the author here, he's got 2 books on Trump's stories involved with the Russia and the KGB. This is one. There's also one, House of Trump, House of Putin, I believe. I would recommend them both. And then also, just to talk about other places in the world, we have Londongrad. This is also famous, and London, like Europe, is moving away. They're moving in the opposite direction of where they were in the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, they were very much open for business, for Russian oligarch money, for nouveau riche Russian oligarch oil money, gas money. Famously, Putin stole Mikhail Khodorkovsky's gas company, oil and gas company, Yukos, in 2003, jailed him for 10 years. Now he lives in exile in the West, Khodorkovsky. That company was eventually floated on the London Stock Exchange. You can look up Rosneft. That was part of Yukos, or I should say Yukos was part of Rosneft. Completely legalized theft from the Kremlin. All right, and we can talk about this all day. We can talk about the TV channels that Putin has monopolized since the year 2000, since the year 2001. Look up the TV channels ORT and NTV and see if you think that that's free speech. This stuff's been going on for a long time, and finally, there we go. Finally, the West is waking up to this. But I find it very interesting that the U.S. is, the West, Western Europe, I should say, is waking up to this and moving away from it. The U.S. is supposedly falling asleep to this and running toward it. So I just say it's a warning from my side. This is an interesting businessman, in my opinion. All right, so after 2022, we did a full blitzkrieg in the West on Russian oligarchs in the West. Okay, if the money could be traced back to Putin, and Bill Browder has always said it's 50% of the take. All right, from 2000, he brought all the oligarchs together, said you can keep your capital, you can keep your cash, just 50% to me, and you let me do whatever I want. No politics in the country. You keep your cash. That was the deal. I don't see why that deal has been proven untrue. He's a 25-year oligarch. If you look at the oligarchs that were actually sanctioned after 2022, after the full-scale invasion started, and you look at the oil money that went to actually killing Ukrainian men, women, and children, as far as I can tell, and Ann Applebaum has written about it, there's only one oligarch from post-2022 that said, I'm going to choose the West over my money. And that's this man, Oleg Tinkoff. All right, he's a banker. I'm not pitying the man. I mean, he, whatever. He was an oligarch. He had money. He was a banker mostly. And he split with the cash. He lost billions. My understanding is he lost billions. I'm not pitying him. I'm sure he probably still has billions. But he was sanctioned, and he had to deal with the sanctions for over a year. Finally, the UK removed the sanctions because Branson, who is a tremendously good character, actually, in my opinion, very big supporter of Ukraine, whatever one might think of his bombastic ways, he had to plead to the UK to remove sanctions on Mr. Tinkoff simply because of all the personal financial sacrifice that Tinkoff suffered as a result of the sanctions. And there was only one. There was Mikhail Friedman. He went back. All the oligarchs, when it came to their money or Western values of not killing Ukrainians, only one followed through of sticking with good values. And that was this man. So to me, this speaks volumes about the damage that store of value per your property or per your Western safe assets can actually do to a society that does not generally share your values. If all of the Russian oligarchs are gone, if they were sanctioned and they just went back to Russia, except for one, that tells you something about what they feel about really the rule of law, or even just how their relationship is so close to the main evil dictator. We all know who that is. It's not Zelensky. We all know that tells you how these relationships actually work. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, sorry for all these boxes here in in the picture. When at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, they're going to stick with the deal that was made with Putin and not part with their money. This was the only one that did it. So it's not easy. It's not easy. And if you had to go back here, you know, we got sea cables being cut almost on a monthly basis, a weekly basis, it seems like. Multiple in the last few months. Taiwan just had one cut, by the way. This is hybrid warfare already started. And we have to see how the West responds. But as far as this one little program of helping the budget of Latvia on an annual basis, I see 0.2%. The United States only has to 3x that to match. So, you know, pari passu, that's not bad. It's clearly achievable. But, you know, if you want to go pari passu, the country of Latvia, that's 150x. It's like, let's say, the top end of what they could actually do. Do you want to bring in 3 million ultra-rich individuals to the United States purely to make 10% on the budget per year? All right, which this is obviously a super high number in my opinion. Or do you want to keep some principles about trying to actually help people that are being pushed out from these high prices? I don't agree with Steve Bannon on many things at all. This is someone who is buddies with Dugin, Putin's horse whisperer, philosopher, who thinks that Europe and the world should be split up between the U.S. and Russia. This is Russia that 1 in 5 people don't have a toilet. This man thinks that he can split up the world with the United States and Russia. And of course, they only say this when Trump is in power. When not, they say that they're going to nuke Washington and D.C. This clearly is a program that someone like Steve Bannon would not be in favor of. All right. And even you remember the fuss that happened with the H-1B. Is that the right H-1B? I think is the right terminology. Those visas for students and for high-skilled workers coming into the United States. Of course, Bannon was on the other side of Musk and Trump there. Again, I'm not saying I know the answer. Like usually in politics, the answer is somewhere in the gray area that you have to compromise on. But he was clearly not there either for the American worker. If you want the American worker to rise up again, you're going to have to invest more in them. And yes, people are going to have to pay more for goods and services. But for the quick fix of bringing in, you know, only higher skilled immigrants or only rich oligarchs from other countries, hopefully what I've said here shows you that you're just going to get higher prices, empty buildings. You might get some money washing and corruption at the least, or you can get people that end up funding the deaths of Ukrainians. So I don't see much good in this type of a deal. It sounds nationalist, it sounds populist, but I think if you look at the end of the day of what it does to the bottom line of a government's budget, I don't think it's anything to write home about. But that's just me. Let's see what happens. Hopefully that story was enjoyable for you. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.